The first time anyone laughed about it was at the implement dealer's showroom in Tipton County, Indiana, in the spring of 1971, when Alvin Reck walked in with an envelope and counted out $4,300 in cash on the service counter for a 1966 International 706 diesel that the dealer had taken in trade 2 weeks before and that had been sitting in the used equipment row waiting for someone who wanted a capable tractor at a price that reflected what it was rather than what it had been when it was new. The dealer, a man named Hofstetter, who had been selling international harvester equipment in Tipton County for 14 years, and whose showroom floor held a current 1456 diesel at a price that started with 9, and whose enthusiasm for used equipment was professional rather than genuine, processed the transaction with a straight face. His salesman, a younger man who was working the counter that morning, did not maintain a straight face entirely. The expression that crossed his face when Alvin counted the last bills out was the expression of someone watching something that struck him as slightly absurd. Not malicious, not contemptuous, just the involuntary register of a man who could not quite reconcile the image in front of him with his understanding of how equipment decisions were supposed to go. The salesman said, to no one in particular, after Alvin had left with the 706's title, $4,300 cash for a 5-year-old tractor when we've got the 56 on the floor. He shook his head slightly. His call. Hofstetter, who was more experienced and more careful than his salesman, said nothing. He put the envelope in the register and wrote the transaction in the ledger. He had processed enough cash sales over 14 years to know that the man who paid cash for used iron was not the man who needed explaining. He was the man who did not need anyone's approval for his own arithmetic. But the salesman's comment was the kind of comment that travels in farming communities, and within 2 weeks, the story of Alvin Reck counting $4,300 cash on the service counter for a 5-year-old 706, while the new 1456 sat on the showroom floor, was a piece of Tipton County conversation that occupied the particular social register of stories that people tell when they want to express mild bewilderment about someone else's choices without quite saying they think the choices are wrong. Alvin heard about it eventually, as people in small counties hear about things that are said about them. He heard it from his neighbor Gunderson, who told him with the specific care of a man who is relaying something because the person ought to know, not because the teller finds it entertaining. Gunderson said the salesman at Hofstetter's had been telling people that Alvin had paid cash for old iron when he could have financed new. Alvin said, "Is that right?" Gunderson said that was what he'd heard. Alvin said, "How much does the 56 cost on payments?" Gunderson said he didn't know exactly. Alvin said he could tell him. He said the 1456 at Hofstetter's stickered at $9,200 with the cab. A standard 7-year agricultural note at current rates produced a monthly payment of $168, which was $2,016 a year. Over 7 years, that was $14,112 paid to retire a $9,200 machine, which meant the financing cost was $4,912, more than Alvin had paid for the 706 outright. He said, at the end of 7 years, the man who financed the 1456 had a paid-off tractor and had paid the bank $4,912 for the privilege of using the tractor while he paid for it. At the end of those same 7 years, Alvin had a paid-off 706 that had cost him $4,300 and whatever maintenance the machine had required, and he had $4,912 still in the farm account that the financed man had given to the bank. Gunderson listened to all of this. He said, "That's a fair point." Alvin said it was arithmetic. He said arithmetic was not a point of view. He drove home and put the 706 to work on the Reck farm outside Sharpsville, which was 163 acres of Tipton County ground that his father had left him and that he had been farming alone since 1965, when his father's health had required him to stop. The farm was not large. The equipment did not need to be large. The 706 was more than adequate for the ground he was working, and the $4,300 was gone from the account. But the account still had what it had because he had been building it from farm income since 1965, and because the $4,300 had not come with $4,900 of additional cost attached to it. He farmed the 706 for 4 years before he added a second machine. The second machine was a 1962 Farmall 560 diesel that he found at an estate dispersal in Hamilton County in the fall of 1975. A well-maintained machine whose estate had maintained it because the man who had farmed it had maintained his equipment as a matter of principle, and the principle was visible in the machine's condition, which was better than machines 7 years younger that had been worked harder or maintained less consistently. He paid $380 for the 560. He serviced it comprehensively. 2 weekends of work, $112 in parts, and put it into service alongside the 706. 2 machines, no notes. Total cost for the pair, $4,812, including all parts and service work since purchase. The Tipton County farming community, which had registered the 1971 cash purchase with mild bewilderment, registered the 1975 dispersal purchase with slightly more. The 560 was a 13-year-old machine, and 13 years in farm equipment was the kind of age that the community generally treated as a signal of imminent failure rather than a statement about a machine that had been maintained correctly. The salesman at Hofstadter's, the same one, who was now a senior salesman rather than a junior one, said something to a customer about the wreck operation running on antiques, which was not accurate and was not kind, but was the kind of shorthand that people use when the real explanation requires more thought than the context supports. Alvin heard about this too. He said nothing about it to anyone. He drove the 560 through the 1976 season without a mechanical issue of consequence, and through the 1977 season in the same condition. And the machine that was going to fail imminently did not fail imminently, and the salesman's comment diminished in the community's memory as comments do when the predicted outcome fails to arrive. What Alvin was doing with his equipment fund across the decade of the 1970s was building a specific number toward a specific purpose that he had identified in 1967, 2 years after he took over the farm, as the most important financial target of his farming operation. The target was not a new tractor, it was land. He had looked at the Tipton County farmland market in 1967 with the specific attention of a man who has a farm. He can farm, but not enough of it. 163 acres was a viable operation at the scale he was running, but it was not expandable without additional ground, and expansion through renting was possible, but expansion through ownership was permanent. He had wanted to own. He had identified the parcel most likely to come available near his operation, the Caldwell 80 acres to the north, which was farmed by a man in his late 60s with no farming heirs who had been talking, for as long as Alvin could remember, about selling when the time was right. He had decided in 1967 that he was going to be ready to buy the Caldwell 80 when it came available. Ready meant having the cash. Having the cash meant not spending the cash on equipment financing. Not spending the cash on equipment financing meant buying used for cash and maintaining the machines rather than replacing them on dealer schedules. The equipment purchases of the 1970s were not independent decisions. They were a single connected decision, the decision to have the capital available for land, expressed across multiple transactions. Every dollar that did not go to Hofstadter's financing department was a dollar that stayed in the farm account and moved toward the Caldwell 80. The Caldwell land came available in the fall of 1979. Leonard Caldwell was 73 years old, and his wife had developed a health condition that required them to move closer to family in Indianapolis, and the 80 acres would be sold because it had to be, not because he had decided to sell. He had called Alvin first, because Alvin was the neighbor, and because Leonard had been watching Alvin farm his father's ground since 1965, and had formed the view that the farm would be well cared for by whoever bought it, and that Alvin would care for it well. Alvin had the money, not all of it. The 80 acres at the late 1970s land price cost more than his equipment fund had accumulated. He used the equipment fund, a term deposit that had been sitting in the Tipton County Savings Bank since 1974, and a short operating note that he structured carefully and paid off in 2 years. He paid Leonard Caldwell's asking price without negotiation because the price was fair and because negotiating a price down from a fair number was the kind of thing that felt clever at the moment and cost more in relationship and reputation than the negotiated savings were worth. He owned 243 acres in Tipton County by the end of 1979. The equipment on those 243 acres was the 706 and the 560, and a set of implements that he had accumulated across the decade with the same cash-only, buy-used, maintain aggressively approach he had applied to the tractors. Total equipment investment since 1965, approximately $9,000, including all parts and service costs. Total equipment debt outstanding, 0. The Tipton County Savings Bank, which held the accounts of most of the farming operations in the county, was in 1979 and into the early 1980s experiencing the same dynamic as every agricultural lender in the Midwest. The combination of inflated land values, high interest rates, and farmers who had borrowed against land that was now worth less than the debt secured against it. The bank was not an aggressive lender. It had not been reckless in the way that some rural banks had been reckless in the expansion years, but it had made loans, as all banks had made loans, against collateral valuations that the crisis years were revealing to be optimistic. In March of 1982, the First Federal Bank of Kokomo, a different institution from the Tipton County Savings Bank, but one that had acquired several smaller agricultural portfolios in the area, was placed in receivership by the Indiana Department of Financial Institutions. The receivership was not a dramatic event by the standards of the farm crisis, which was producing institutional failures regularly by that point, but it was a specific and local event that the Tipton County farming community absorbed differently than they absorbed the national news of what was happening to farm banks generally. 4 farming operations in the county had primary lending relationships with First Federal Kokomo. Those 4 operations received letters from the FDIC, which was managing the receivership, informing them that their notes had been transferred to the acquiring institution and that the terms of their loans would be honored, but that certain accommodation arrangements that had been informally maintained by the previous lending officers were no longer in effect. The informal accommodation arrangements, extensions on payments, temporary modifications to terms that had been agreed verbally rather than documented, had been the thing that had allowed 3 of the 4 operations to continue functioning through the first 2 years of the crisis. When the bank failed and the FDIC entered, the informal arrangements ended. 2 of the 4 operations were ultimately foreclosed. One negotiated a restructuring that was difficult and that left the farmer with significantly less land than he had entered the crisis with. One, the Brunner operation on the south end of the county, managed to arrange a refinancing through a different institution and came through with the farm intact, though the process had taken a year and had been, in the Brunner family's telling, the most difficult year of their farming lives. Alvin Reck had no relationship with First Federal Kokomo. He had no relationship with any lending institution in a note capacity. The short note he had used to complete the Caldwell land purchase had been with the Tipton County Savings Bank and had been retired in 1981. His farm account was at the same institution, but an account is not a note, and the bank crisis hit differently when your relationship with the bank was depositor rather than borrower. He watched the spring of 1982 unfold in the farming community with the specific observation of a man who has made his financial decisions in a way that has placed him outside the immediate crisis. He watched the 4 First Federal operations. He watched the Brunner refinancing. He watched the 2 foreclosures. He did not say anything publicly about any of this because there was nothing to say that would have been either useful or kind. The men who were losing their farms had not made foolish decisions in a vacuum. They had made decisions that were appropriate by the standards of the late 1970s, when land values were rising, commodity prices were strong, and agricultural lenders were eager to extend credit against appreciating collateral. The decisions had become problems when the external conditions changed, and the change in conditions was not something any individual farmer had caused or could have prevented. But the external conditions had also not touched the Reck operation. The farm was farming. The equipment was working. The account had no notes against it. The 243 acres were producing corn and soybeans on the same schedule they had always produced, uninterrupted by the regulatory intervention that had ended the farming seasons for the 2 foreclosed operations. He added a piece of equipment that spring, a 1974 John Deere 4320 diesel that he bought at the dispersal auction of one of the foreclosed operations for $1,100, which was below what the machine was worth by a meaningful margin, because dispersal auctions in foreclosure situations produced prices that reflected the urgency of the liquidation rather than the value of the asset. He paid $1,100 cash. He drove the 4320 home. He serviced it. He put it to work. He was aware of the specific nature of what had happened. that he had bought a machine at a distressed price from an operation that had failed partly because of equipment debt, using money that existed in his account because he had not taken on equipment debt. And the awareness was not comfortable in the way that awareness of someone else's difficulty rarely is comfortable. He had not caused the difficulty. He had not benefited from it in any meaningful sense beyond the transaction price. But the transaction made visible the specific relationship between his approach and the crisis in a way that other events of the spring did not. He had not designed his financial approach to position himself to buy equipment at distressed prices during a banking crisis. He had designed it to own the Caldwell 80. The banking crisis had arrived afterward, as external conditions arrive, without invitation and without concern for anyone's design. What his design had produced, as a secondary consequence, was that when the crisis arrived, he was the farmer who could keep farming, while the bank that the other farmers had borrowed from was being managed by the FDIC. He told this to the Tipton County Savings Bank's agricultural loan officer in the fall of 1982, when the loan officer, a careful man named Breels, who had been in agricultural lending for 20 years, had asked Alvin during a routine account review what he thought had made the difference between his situation and the situations of the operations that had failed. Alvin said, "I never let the bank know my equipment better than I did." Breels had looked at him. He said, "What does that mean?" Alvin said, "When you finance equipment, the bank knows exactly what you owe and exactly what the collateral is worth, and those two numbers define your position. When you pay cash for used equipment, the bank doesn't know what you have, and neither does anyone else. The equipment I have out there is worth what it would sell for if I sold it, which is more than I paid for it because I bought it right and maintained it right, and that value is mine entirely. No lien, no note, no institution that can decide the collateral position has changed." Breels had been quiet for a moment. He had said, "That's a specific way of thinking about equipment." Alvin had said it was the way his father had thought about equipment, and his father had farmed through the Depression without losing the farm, and the Depression had been worse than the current crisis by a significant margin. He had driven home and turned into the lane and seen the 706 and the 560 and the 4320 in the equipment yard, and had felt the specific satisfaction of a man looking at things he owns completely, not in the complicated sense of owing a note on them, not in the contingent sense of holding them subject to a bank's assessment of the collateral, but in the simple and absolute sense of having paid for them from money he earned and having no further obligation associated with their presence in his yard. The farm survived the crisis the way things survive crises when they are not positioned within the crisis's reach, not through dramatic action, not through clever maneuvering, but through the absence of the specific vulnerabilities that the crisis exploited. The crisis exploited debt against inflated collateral. Alvin had debt against no collateral because he had no equipment debt and his land note had been retired the year before the bank failed. The crisis had no purchase on the wreck operation. The Tipton County Savings Bank, to its credit, survived the crisis as well. It had been careful enough in its lending that the farm crisis reduced its agricultural portfolio's performance without threatening the institution itself. It emerged from the crisis years in a position to continue serving the county's farming community, which it did through the 1980s and into the 1990s. Some of the operations it had served did not emerge in the same condition. Several land parcels changed hands at prices that reflected the distress of the sellers. The farmland market in Tipton County declined through the early 1980s and began recovering in the mid-1980s as commodity prices stabilized and the credit environment normalized. Alvin bought one more parcel in 1984, a 40-acre field that had been part of a foreclosed operations liquidation, bought at a price that reflected the market bottom more than the land's agricultural value. He paid cash from the farm account. He farmed it in the 1985 season alongside the rest of the wreck ground, as if it had always been his. He owned 283 acres in Tipton County by the end of 1984, all paid for. The salesman at Hofstadter's implement dealership, the one who had commented on Alvin counting cash in 1971 and had said something about antiques when Alvin bought the 560 in 1975, had left the dealership by 1982. He had gone into a different business. He was not present for the banking crisis or for its aftermath in the county's farming community. and he was not present when Alvin drove home from the dispersal auction in the spring of 1982 with the 4320 behind the truck. Hofstetter, who had been present for all of it, had retired from the dealership in 1983. He had watched Alvin Reck's operation for 12 years from the implement dealer's perspective, the cash purchases, the used machines, the refusal to engage with the financing department, and had formed, in those 12 years, a view about what he had been watching. He said to his successor in the dealership, when the handover was happening in the fall of 1983, "The Reck operation is sound. If he ever comes in to buy something, give him the best price you can without margin games. He knows what things are worth and he pays what he determines is fair, and he doesn't negotiate down from fair. Treat him right." The successor had asked why the instruction about a specific customer. Hofstetter had said, "Because in 12 years of watching him make cash purchases of used equipment while the new iron sat on the floor, I never once saw him flinch. That kind of steadiness is worth respecting." The successor had noted this. He applied the instruction when Alvin came in the following year for a head gasket set for the 706, which was a small transaction, and applied it again in 1986 when Alvin bought a used white 2105 from the trade lot at a cash price that both men agreed was fair, without the negotiation that usually attended that kind of purchase. The white 2105 was Alvin's first machine that was not from the International Harvester family. He had made the transition because White Farm Equipment's larger machines were reaching a capable range for the scale of his operation, and a clean used 2105 at the right price was the right machine at the right moment. He assessed it over 20 minutes at the trade lot, made his offer, and drove it home. He was 52 years old in 1986, and his operation was producing at a level that made the Tipton County farming community, the part of it that had been present for the 1971 cash purchase and the 1975 dispersal sale and the 1982 crisis and all the years between, look at the Reck farm with a reassessment that some of them said out loud and most of them did not. The ones who said it out loud said versions of the same thing, that Alvin Reck had been right about his approach for a long time, and that the evidence had accumulated to the point where the right characterization was not amusing eccentricity, but consistent wisdom. They said it at the elevator and at the extension meetings and at the county fair, in the way that farming communities eventually revise assessments that the evidence has made untenable. Alvin did not engage with the revisions. He was not particularly interested in the community's assessment of his approach, favorable or unfavorable. He had been making the decisions for 20 years based on his own arithmetic and his own reading of what his operation needed, and the arithmetic had not changed because the community's assessment of it had changed. The farm account that he maintained at the Tipton County Savings Bank had been growing steadily since 1965, with withdrawals for equipment purchases and land purchases, and the ordinary operating costs of the farm and deposits from the crop income and the occasional custom work he did for neighbors. It had never gone to zero. It had never required a note to supplement it. It was the product of 20 years of not spending what had not been earned on things that could be purchased used for cash and maintained rather than replaced. He had not started the account with any philosophical commitment to what it would become. He had started it because he inherited a farm and a farming approach from his father, and because his father's approach, pay cash, buy used, maintain what you have, spend from income, had kept the Reck farm solvent through the Depression and through the lean years of the late 1940s when farming margins were thin everywhere, and the operations that had borrowed heavily were the operations that were struggling to stay whole. His father's approach had been his father's approach before it was Alvin's, and the Depression was his father's data the way the 1982 banking crisis was Alvin's data. The data was different in scale and cause but identical in the lesson it produced. The operation with no debt was the operation that kept farming when the operations with debt were losing the farm. He farmed the 283 acres until 1997, when he was 63 years old and the physical demand of active farming was more than his body recommended, and when his son Dennis had been working in the operation for 8 years and was ready to take the full weight of it. The transfer was gradual and documented and involved no drama, because Alvin had thought about the transfer for years before it happened, and had organized the documentation and the financial structure with the same methodical care he had applied to equipment purchases. Dennis received a farm without debt on any of its assets. He received an equipment yard with 3 paid-for tractors and a full set of implements and a maintenance approach he had been watching his father apply since he was 8 years old. He received an account at the Tipton County Savings Bank that held the operating reserve and the equipment fund as separate line items, maintained separately because the discipline of separate accounting was part of the inheritance along with the accounts themselves. He received the 706 as well, which was still in the yard and still running in 1997, 26 years after his father had counted $4,300 on the service counter at Hofstadter's. It was not in primary service anymore. It had not been in primary service for several years, but it was maintained, started regularly, kept in the operational condition of a machine that might be needed rather than the decorative condition of a machine that was being preserved for appearance. Dennis had asked his father in the years before the handover why the 706 stayed in the yard when it was long past primary service, and when the space it occupied in the equipment barn was space that a more useful machine might occupy. Alvin had said the 706 was useful in a different way than a primary field machine was useful. He had said, "When you're sitting in that barn on a winter evening doing equipment maintenance and you want to remember why you do everything the way you do it, the 706 tells you. It was the first machine I bought on my own decision, paid for in cash." While the salesman shook his head about it, everything in this yard came from that decision. The 706 is the first link in the chain. Dennis had said, "So you keep it to remember." Alvin had said, "I keep it because chains need their first link. Take the first link out and you've got a pile of connected pieces with no beginning, and things without a beginning are harder to understand than they need to be." Dennis had put the 706 in the same barn space where it had always been. He had not taken it out. He had started it each spring and fall. He had maintained it the way his father had maintained it, which was the way his grandfather had maintained the equipment before that, from the conviction that machines lasted as long as they were cared for, and that caring for them was cheaper than replacing them, and that the money saved from caring for them and not replacing them was the money that paid for land. The land was what lasted. The land was what remained when the equipment was eventually retired, and the barn was eventually rebuilt, and the account continued in a different set of hands. The rec farm was still the rec farm in the 21st century. 283 acres in Tipton County, Indiana, farmed by Dennis Reck and his own son after him, the chain extending forward from the first link that Alvin had set in 1971 when he counted $4,300 on a service counter while a salesman registered the moment with mild bewilderment. The salesman had moved on to other things. The farm was still the farm. The 706 was in the barn. The chain held. That was the whole accounting of it, and the accounting was complete. The specific character of Alvin Reck's father, the man whose approach had produced the farming philosophy that Alvin had inherited and applied across his own career, was something that Alvin talked about rarely and specifically, in the way that men of his generation talked about their fathers, not with sentiment and not with frequency, but with precision when the subject came up, and with a respect that was evident in the precision. His father's name was Walter Reck, and Walter had bought the 163 Tipton County acres in 1938, not in the worst years of the Depression. He had not had the capital in the worst years, but in the late Depression, when the land market was still depressed, but when Walter had saved enough from 7 years of hired farming work to make the purchase at the price the land required. He had farmed hired for 7 years specifically to accumulate the capital. He had not bought land until he could buy it for cash, because Walter's view, formed from watching the land foreclosures of the early 1930s, was that land bought on credit was land whose ownership was conditional, and conditional ownership was not the same as ownership. He had told Alvin this when Alvin was 12 years old, sitting at the kitchen table one winter evening when the farm business was being discussed in the way that farm business was discussed in farm kitchens, when the children were old enough to be present for it, not as instruction exactly, but as conversation in which the children were allowed to participate and from which they absorbed what they absorbed. Walter had said, "The men who lost their farms in the 30s didn't lose them because they were bad farmers. They lost them because they had borrowed against something that changed value, and when the value changed, the lender's position changed, and when the lender's position changed, the farmer's title changed. That's not farming. That's holding something for the bank until the bank decides it needs it back." Alvin had been 12 years old when he heard this. He had not understood it completely at 12. He had understood it more completely at 20, when he took over the farm. He had understood it completely in 1982, when the First Federal Bank of Kokomo entered receivership, and the farming operations that had borrowed from it discovered that the bank's decision about its own position had overridden their decisions about their own farms. Walter's framework, credit is conditional ownership, and conditional ownership is holding something for the bank, was the framework Alvin had carried into every equipment purchase decision and every land acquisition decision across his farming life. It was not a theory. It was an observation about a specific historical event that Walter had watched from close enough to understand its mechanism, and the observation had become a principle through the specificity of the mechanism. The mechanism was the bank's ability, when the collateral value fell below the note balance, to convert the farmer's conditional ownership into the bank's actual ownership. The mechanism was exact, and its operation was inevitable once the conditions were met. The conditions could be prevented from being met by never creating the note. No note, no mechanism, no conditional ownership. Unconditional ownership was the farm staying the farm, regardless of what the bank decided. Alvin had applied this framework with a consistency that the Tipton County farming community found across 20 years, either puzzling or admirable depending on the moment and the observer. In the years when new equipment was affordable and financing was favorable and the farm economy was strong, the community found it puzzling. Why would a man pay cash for used equipment when the new equipment dealer was offering rates that seemed manageable and the machines were measurably superior? In the years when the farm crisis was liquidating operations that had borrowed, the community found it admirable. How had he known? How had he seen this coming? He had not seen it coming. He had not been managing against the risk of a specific banking crisis in a specific year. He had been managing against the mechanism that Walter had explained at the kitchen table when Alvin was 12, the mechanism by which conditional ownership became unconditional dispossession. The banking crisis had activated that mechanism for the farmers who had borrowed. It had found no purchase on the wreck operation because the mechanism required a note, and there was no note. He had not been smart about the future. He had been clear about the mechanism and had structured his operation to stay outside its reach. There is a difference, and the difference matters, because the wisdom was not predictive. Alvin had not predicted the 1982 banking crisis. He had not known that First Federal Kokomo would enter receivership or that the FDIC would end the informal accommodation arrangements that had been keeping 4 Tipton County operations functioning. He had not known any of this. He had known that the mechanism of conditional ownership could activate under conditions he could not predict, and he had therefore operated in a way that kept him outside the mechanism's reach under any conditions. This was the same reasoning that Walter had applied in 1938 when he waited until he had cash to buy the farm, rather than buying it earlier on credit. Walter had not predicted the specific form the Depression would take, or the specific mechanism by which it would liquidate the operations that had borrowed. He had observed the liquidations and had identified the mechanism and had organized his own position to stay outside the mechanism's reach. The knowledge passed from Walter to Alvin at a kitchen table in 1951, and from Alvin to Dennis across decades of working together, and from Dennis to his own son in the same form. Not as instruction, not as formal teaching, but as the accumulated demonstration of an approach applied consistently across different conditions and different years, visible to anyone who worked alongside it long enough to see what it was doing and why. The approach had a cost. Alvin had farmed smaller equipment than his Tipton County neighbors through most of the 1970s, when his operations scale and the available financing would have supported larger machines, and when the larger machines would have allowed him to farm more acres more efficiently. He had accepted this limitation because the efficiency gain from the larger machine was measurable, and the risk cost of the note was also measurable, and the risk cost in his calculation exceeded the efficiency gain. He had been right about this calculation in the specific terms of the 1982 crisis. He might have been wrong about it if the crisis had not happened, or if the crisis had happened differently, or if the banking environment had remained stable long enough for the financed machines to pay off before any disruption occurred. He had been right about the calculation not because he had known the future, but because he had calculated the cost of the risk honestly rather than optimistically, and because honest risk accounting tends to favor conservative positions over time when the risk being assessed is the risk of dispossession. You can optimize for the expected case or you can protect against the bad case, and the two optimizations require different decisions. Alvin had protected against the bad case, which meant accepting a cost inefficiency and scale during the expected case. The expected case had produced a functioning farm. The bad case, the 1982 banking crisis, had validated the protection. Dennis had asked him once whether he had ever regretted the efficiency cost. Whether there had been years, in the 1970s when the farm economy was good and the financing rates were reasonable, when he had looked at the new equipment on the dealer's floor and wished his circumstances allowed him to buy it. Alvin had said, "Every spring, every planting season when I was working ground with equipment that was 10 or 15 years old, and the neighbor had a new cab tractor with the climate control, and I was sitting in the weather, I noticed every time." Dennis had said, "But you didn't buy." Alvin had said, "No." Dennis had said, "Why not?" Alvin had said, "Because noticing something is better than the thing you have doesn't mean the thing you have is insufficient." The 706 planted every acre of this farm for 15 years, not in comfort, but planted. The discomfort of the equipment is a cost I can calculate. The cost of the note is a cost that includes variables I can't predict, and the variables I can't predict include a bank deciding my collateral position has changed. I knew the first cost. I didn't know the second. Dennis had thought about this for several days after the conversation. He had come back to his father and said, "You were paying in discomfort so you wouldn't have to pay in uncertainty." Alvin had looked at him for a moment. He had said, "That's a more elegant way of saying it than I said it." Dennis had said he'd had a few days to think about it. Alvin had said the elegance was correct. He had gone back to whatever he had been doing, which was probably something in the equipment barn, and Dennis had stayed with the idea that discomfort was a known cost, and uncertainty was an unknown one, and that the person who chose known costs over unknown ones was not being timid but was being precise about what could and could not be calculated. The Tipton County Savings Bank, where Alvin's account had lived since 1965, went through its own modest difficulties in the farm crisis years and came out the other side intact. Its agricultural portfolio had been carefully managed, and the bank's exposure to the worst of the crisis was limited. The bank's agricultural loan officer, Breels, the man who had asked Alvin in 1982 what he thought had made the difference, had been doing agricultural lending long enough to have developed a version of Alvin's own framework. The operation with no equipment debt and paid-for land was the operation he worried least about in a crisis. And the operation he worried least about in a crisis was the operation he worked hardest to serve when the crisis was over. Because good operations deserved good. Banking relationships and good banking relationships were built on trust that was demonstrated in the bad years, rather than claimed in the good ones. He had demonstrated this trust by being helpful to Alvin in the ways that were possible to be helpful to a depositor who had no debt. Useful account structures, timely information about agricultural lending rates for the hypothetical day when Alvin might want a note for land. The kind of banking relationship that functioned as a resource rather than a liability. Alvin had appreciated this. He had said so, once, directly. He had said to Breels, "You've been a fair banker across a long time. That matters more than it probably sounds." Breels had said it mattered to him because fair banking was the only kind he knew how to do. Alvin had said he believed him. The relationship between a depositor who had never needed a loan and a banker who had served him across 20 years without ever having the leverage that a note would have provided was a relationship built entirely on goodwill and demonstrated performance. The depositor's performance as a farmer and the banker's performance as a steward of other people's money. That kind of relationship was rarer than it should have been and more valuable than it looked. And both men understood this without needing to say it frequently. The farm account at the Tipton County Savings Bank, maintained by Alvin and then by Dennis, had never gone to zero. It had never required supplementation from a note. It had funded equipment purchases, land purchases, the operating costs of 283 acres of Tipton County ground, and the transfer of the operation from one generation to the next. It had done all of this because the money in it had not been spoken for in advance by the payment schedule on a note. The absence of the note was the source of the fund's continuity. The continuity of the fund was the source of the farm's continuity. The farm's continuity was the point. The 706 in the barn was the beginning of the chain. The chain had $4,300 at the start of it and 283 acres at the point where Dennis farmed it, and nothing borrowed anywhere in between. The salesman at Hofstadter's had shaken his head in 1971. The farm was still the farm in the 21st century. The arithmetic had been correct. It had always been correct. The arithmetic did not care whether anyone laughed. The 4 farming operations in Tipton County that had their notes with First Federal Bank of Kokomo were not strangers to Alvin. He had known all 4 families for years, had farmed alongside them, had sat near them at extension meetings, had bought grain at the same elevator. 2 of the 4 were men he considered, if not close friends, then the kind of neighbors whose company he valued and whose farming he respected. The Holtman operation was one of those 2. Glenn Holtman was 48 years old in 1982 and had been farming 340 acres in the western part of the county with a style that was competent and serious. He had borrowed to buy a new John Deere 4440 in 1978 and to expand his planted acres through a rented parcel that required a short-term operating note in addition to the equipment note. He had done this at a time when the land values were supporting his balance sheet and the commodity prices were supporting his cash flow, and both decisions had been reasonable in the context of 1978. By 1982, the context had changed. The commodity prices had fallen. The land values had fallen. The 4440 note was still running, the interest charges now consuming a portion of the cash flow that the reduced commodity prices were producing from the same acreage. And then the first federal letter arrived, and the FDIC letter after it, and the accommodation arrangement that had allowed Glenn to defer 2 payments while the commodity prices sorted themselves out was no longer in effect. He had restructured eventually. The Holtman operation had come through the crisis intact. Glenn was a good negotiator and had a banking relationship in neighboring Howard County that allowed him to refinance the first federal note at terms that were tight but workable. The process had taken 11 months. The 11 months had been the most difficult period of Glenn's farming life. He had told Alvin about it afterward, in the specific way that farming men discuss difficulties, not with self-pity and not with drama, but with the flat precision of someone who has been through something real and wants to describe it accurately. He said the worst part was not the financial pressure, though the financial pressure had been severe. The worst part had been the 11 months of not knowing whether the farm would be there at the end of the process. Alvin had listened. He had not said anything about his own financial position during Glenn's account of the 11 months, because there was nothing useful to say. The difference between his position and Glenn's position was not a matter of virtue. Glenn had made reasonable decisions with the information and conditions of 1978, and the conditions had changed in ways that neither man had predicted. Alvin had made different decisions with the same information and the same conditions, but the decisions had not been better because they were more foresighted. They had been different because they were built on Walter's framework, the framework that said conditional ownership was not ownership. And Walter's framework was specific to what Walter had watched in the 1930s and was not a universal prescription for equipment and land acquisition. He had thought about this distinction carefully in the months after the crisis had resolved for Glenn and for the other operations in the county. The farming community was conducting its own retrospective analysis, the way farming communities do after crises, assigning causes and lessons and characterizations to what had happened. The analysis tended to favor explanations that located the cause in individual decision-making rather than in the systemic conditions that had made the individual decisions reasonable at the time they were made. Alvin's position in this retrospective was awkward. His operation had come through the crisis without difficulty, which made him a data point in the community's analysis of what had made the difference. But his operation had come through because of a framework he had inherited from his father's experience of a different crisis, not because he had been more foresighted than Glenn Holtman or the other men who had borrowed in 1978. He had applied his father's framework consistently across the years. The framework had protected him. He had not known it would need to protect him in this specific way at this specific time. He said as much to Breels when Breels raised the subject during the 1983 account review. Briels had said the wreck operation was notable for having come through the crisis without the restructuring conversations that had occupied most of his other agricultural accounts over the previous year. Alvin had said the operation had come through because it had no notes. And it had no notes because his father had explained the mechanism of conditional ownership at a kitchen table in 1951, and the explanation had stuck. Briels had said, "Most people don't carry a lesson from 30 years ago into daily practice." Alvin had said, "Most people don't watch their neighbors' farms foreclose when they're 12 years old." He had not meant this as a self-congratulatory observation. He had meant it as the most accurate description he could give of why the lesson had stuck: proximity to the consequence. He had been close enough to the Depression's agricultural consequences to have them made specific and visible by a man who had watched them happen. Specific and visible consequences are more adhesive than abstract principles. The lesson that farming without debt is safer than farming with debt was an abstract principle. The lesson that conditional ownership had allowed the Tipton County farms of the 1930s to be taken from men who had made reasonable decisions under different conditions was a specific observation about specific events that had specific causes and specific effects. Specific lessons stick. Abstract principles drift. Walter had given Alvin the specific lesson. Alvin had applied it. The application had been maintained for 20 years through the force of the specificity. The concrete memory of what his father had described, sitting at the kitchen table, when the winter evening was cold outside and the farm was quiet, and the lesson was being given not as instruction, but as the honest telling of what his father had seen. He had given Dennis the same lesson in the same way, not as instruction, but as the telling of what Alvin had seen. The 1982 crisis was Alvin's Depression equivalent. Specific events, specific mechanisms, specific consequences for specific operations, witnessed from close enough to be made concrete rather than abstract. Dennis had the specific lesson the way Alvin had the specific lesson. Whether Dennis's son would inherit it was a question that depended on whether the lesson remained specific enough across the generation to maintain its adhesiveness. Abstract principles drift. Specific lessons about specific events witnessed from close enough to make them real had a different longevity. The 706 in the barn helped. The first link in the chain was a specific object that could be touched and started and driven, and a specific object that can be touched and started and driven is more resistant to abstraction than a principle stated without an object. The 706 was the object. The lesson was in the object for anyone who knew what the object was and where it had come from and what it had started. Dennis knew. His son was learning. The chain extended forward from the 1971 cash purchase the way chains extend, through the specific connections that each link made with the next, through the demonstrated continuity of the approach across different years and different conditions and different members of the family who had applied it. The farming community of Tipton County had watched the chain being built since 1971, without always recognizing it as a chain. They had seen individual transactions, the cash purchase, the used machine, the dispersal sale acquisition during the crisis, and had formed individual assessments of each transaction. The assessments had shifted over time from bewilderment to something closer to understanding, but the understanding was still partial because the full picture of the chain was not visible from outside. From inside, from the perspective of the farm account and the equipment yard and the barn where the 706 was parked, the full picture was legible. It was legible because all the transactions were connected, and the connection was maintained by the consistency of the framework across 20 years of different conditions. The framework was Walter's. Alvin had applied it. Dennis had received it. The farm was the farm. That was the full accounting. There was nothing more that needed to be said, and Alvin, who was not a man who said more than needed to be said, had never said more than that. He had farmed. He had paid cash. He had bought used. He had maintained what he had. He had not borrowed against things whose value could change. The bank that 4 of his neighbors had borrowed from had failed in March of 1982. He had kept farming in April. The arithmetic had never changed. The 706 was in the barn. The chain held. The farm was still the farm. The salesman's comment in 1971 was a long time ago and a long distance from where the operation had arrived. And neither the distance nor the time had been traveled by luck or by cleverness or by anything other than the consistent application of an approach that Walter had explained at a kitchen table when the winter was cold outside and the farm was quiet, and the lesson was being given honestly to a 12-year-old boy who would not understand it fully for another 31 years. He had understood it in April of 1982, driving home from the dispersal auction with the 4320 behind the truck, the farm account intact, the equipment yard no debt, the land paid for, the chain unbroken. He had understood it completely then. He had never needed to understand it again. Once was enough. The winter evenings were long in Tipton County, and the equipment barn was cold, and the work in the barn was the kind of work that produced no immediate visible result, only the slow accumulation of maintained machines that would be ready when the spring required them. Alvin had done that work across 30 years. Dennis did it now. The barn held what it held. The chain held what it held. The account had no notes against it. That was the full measure of it, and the full measure was enough.